All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Pastor Tim here with Real Life Talk, and we're super excited to be continuing this podcast with you. I'm here with my buddy Matt. How you doing, Matt?
Doing good, thank you. Always glad to be here.
Yeah. So we're also have a really special episode for you today because we have a special guest I'll introduce in a moment. But before we do that, just want to remind you why we're doing this talk. And, it's really on our heart to just talk about real life and real issues to really make our faith practical and real, in our lives. And so we don't know exactly what we're going to talk about today, but we've got some really fun information to share with you. So we'll see where it goes, but really glad that you're able to join us. And so I want to introduce to you our prominent guest here, and this is Dr. Grady McMurtry. He is the founder of Creation Worldview Ministries, and he's been a biblical, scientific creationist for over about 50 years.
Yes, sir. That's right.
And we are so privileged to have you today, and you've been with us for a few days here at our church sharing a lot of creationist apologetics and different topics with us.
Been a pleasure.
Yeah. So welcome. So glad to have you today. It's looking forward to just hearing your insights on so many things that we are all curious about. So, let's start with a little bit of your story. I understand that you shared with me recently that you started out as an evolutionist, maybe an agnostic. I'm not sure how you describe your relationship with God early in your life, but and then you went through this journey to become who you are today. And I just would love to hear a little bit more about your testimony and what brought you to this point.
Well, I was born in a family that believed in evolution. I was born in San Francisco, California, in Chinatown. And a few years later, we moved over to Berkeley. So I actually grew up on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. The reason for that, my father had been a poli-sci student. Got his degrees at Berkeley, became a teaching professor at Berkeley. And so that's why I was being raised there. Mm-hmm. But while my father was a political scientist, I'm a natural, physical, biological scientist. And that was my interest. And so I spent a lot of time in school being indoctrinated in evolution because in California, that's all they taught was evolution. And I'm talking even in the 50s. Mm-hmm. But I spent a lot of time in the paleontology laboratories at Cal Berkeley. Growing up as a child. And so I believed in evolution. I would actually start teaching other children evolution at the age of 8.
Wow.
And the reason was because I knew more about it than the teachers did. Yeah. And they actually started borrowing me from one classroom to the other, and I was teaching evolution to not only the students, but even to the teachers. And so they would borrow me from classroom to classroom in the California public school system. And I really did start teaching evolution at 8. But evolution is simply the taproot of atheism. True evolution, if you believe it entirely, completely, no ifs, ands, or buts, is atheism. But I would not have described myself that way. And of course, in those days, I didn't even really think about the terminology.
Right.
I would probably be better classified in those days as an agnostic, because if evolution was true, and I thought it was, after all, if that's the only thing you're taught, then you would like to think that your teachers wouldn't lie to you. No, they will. They will. And they'll try to indoctrinate you, and they'll try to get you into believing whatever philosophy they want, whatever worldview they want. But I was not a militant atheist. And that's why I say, even though I didn't really know the terms at the time or think about it, it's probably better agnostic. And an agnostic simply means without knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so the concept of agnosticism would be that God might exist, certainly doesn't preclude his existence, but that you can't know him, without knowledge, that you can't know him. So even if he existed, it doesn't matter because you can't know him. And so he's a God that is basically irrelevant.
Yeah.
If he can't be a part of your life, then he's irrelevant. And so for me, it wasn't militant atheism like a Richard Dawkins. It was simply, if evolution was true, then God wasn't knowable or didn't exist, and we go on from there.
Yeah, but in a sense, it's like you described it, it's almost like a religion itself.
Oh, it is a religion. As a matter of fact, The religion of atheism, technically called secular humanism.
Okay.
That's the name of the actual religion. And it has its tenets, it has its doctrines and so forth, just as any other religion, just as Christianity or any other religion. And I have an article on my website talking about the 3 humanist manifestos. And the humanist manifestos are the doctrines and tenets of atheism.
Mm-hmm.
And all 3 of them require a belief in what is referred to generally as chemical evolution or something like that. That it's all existential, rationalistic, it's all naturalism, that there's no God, there's no outside creator, designer at all, that everything is, well, they do have a God. It's actually the God of random chance. But that the tenets of their religion, of atheism, is that you must believe in evolution, that there is no God, and there's no such thing as supernatural, that it is only the natural. And they limit themselves in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up that way, I was not educated. Now, proper education requires that you be taught both sides of an issue equally, and then the student is allowed to decide for themselves. And frankly, I'm totally happy with that if we would do it in the public school systems.
Yeah.
But instead, the public school systems are indoctrinating students. They're not educating them. They're only being taught one side of the issue, and they're not being allowed to think about others for themselves. And if they do try to think about others, then they're quashed down.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's kind of like they still call it the theory of evolution, but they teach it like it's fact,
Agreed. However, it's not a theory. I mean, that's what people are used to.
Yeah.
And so everybody, even I will call it the theory of evolution. Although, first of all, it's not the theory of evolution. It's the theories of evolution.
Okay.
If you had a million evolutionists in one room, you'd have 1,000,001 theories of evolution.
Yeah.
Because no 2 would agree on how it occurred. And by the time you got through the first room, the first guy would have changed his mind.
Yeah.
And so there's no such thing as the theory.
Okay.
Secondly, it's not a theory in the true scientific sense. And when I say that, because if you understand the scientific method, to be a theory, elevated to a theory, it must be testable.
Okay.
And evolution is not testable directly. You can't use science to test it directly. You have to test it indirectly. It's really, technically, a working hypothesis, and it's not a very good one. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But by convention, we call it theory.
Okay.
People just don't understand the difference in the scientific terminology. But I was in that position, and I would continue to get my education. We would move in 1961 from Berkeley. We would leave California, and I went to high school in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean in the D.C., not in the Maryland or Virginia. I went to high school near Walter Reed Hospital and continued to learn evolution. And then, of course, I would go on to earn my science degrees as an evolutionist, and I would go on to teach it. I taught it from the 7th grade to the university level in my early career.
Okay.
But at the age of 27, I did what a good scientist should do. A good scientist doesn't seek knowledge. There's a lot of fake stuff out there these days, deep fakes and really deep fakes and just downright lies. And
Yeah.
And so a good scientist doesn't seek knowledge because there's a lot of fake knowledge out there. What a good scientist does is seek truth.
Yeah, that's good.
Now, God taught the modern scientific method in the book of Job 4,000 years ago, in the first chapters of Job. He teaches the modern scientific method. The problem is people forgot it, literally. And it wasn't until 400 years ago when Christian, creation-believing scientists rediscovered the modern scientific method. So you go back to the days of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, and you go on through people like Boyle and Faraday, Pasteur, George Washington Carver. These were all Christians who believed in creation. And if you look at the history of science, the almost every single scientific field that exists, almost every single truly great discovery was made by Christian creation-believing scientists. Evolutionists can't really do it because if you believe in random chance, then there's no way to get any, again, observable, repeatable, verifiable results.
Mm-hmm.
And so 400 years ago and up to today, we rediscovered the modern scientific method. If it were not for Christianity, there would be no modern science.
Wow.
And I know it's bold, but it's true.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Well, but again, it is true. And so when you look at the history of science, that's what you'll find. And even evolutionists, Dr. Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard admitted that if it wasn't for Christianity, modern science wouldn't exist. Now, he didn't agree with it, but he admitted it. He was both a professor of paleontology and also a science historian. And so he did both.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with, isn't hospitals and education and all these great things came out of a Christian movement, right?
Correct. I mean, it was, the universities came out of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, initially, it was predominantly Catholic, with the teaching orders that would go around the world and actually come up and institute the university system. And so, again, you wouldn't have the universities technically if it weren't for that, although you might in the modern time, but that's how they originally came into existence.
Yeah. So 27 years old,
Mm-hmm.
You've been an evolutionist your whole life, teaching it, and you decided to get serious about your actual scientific approach to this, or to what happened when you were 27?
Well, again, a good science seeks truth, right?
Okay.
Now, I had taught only evolution, but I'm an early baby boomer, and you couldn't grow up in the late 40s, 50s in the United States without knowing something about Christianity. I mean, that was the most ubiquitous religion in the States.
Yeah.
And so, you knew about Jesus Christ and Mary and, as we sometimes called it, Easter and all that. But if you are unwilling to learn, you'll never change. But I was willing to learn. And so in looking at these claims of different religions and so forth, I started with Christianity first because it's the one I knew only a little about, but more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody would know that Jesus Christ claimed to be God, that he claimed to be the Son of God, that people had said he had done all kinds of works, and you knew that he claimed to be resurrected, etc. So what I did was I simply said, okay, either he's telling the truth or he's not.
Right.
That is a proposition we can deal with. There's actually three possibilities, but two fundamentally. And so I took my academic scholastic skills and I said, okay, I'm going to decide for myself whether Jesus was telling the truth or not. Again, not a new argument. And so for 6 months, I studied the Bible, read it for the first time. I took a look at all the historians of that time who had actually talked about Jesus. People think maybe, if they know anything of these things, that Josephus might be the only one that had written about it, and that's not true. There's at least 9 to 12 historians of the time who are reliable historians who, in fact, talk about him in some way or another.
Okay. I didn't know that.
And, I have that in my book on the feasts, that I incorporate the historians simply to help show the documentation. And so these historians said that this guy, he existed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the existence of the man, Jesus Christ, is better established than many of the ancient people would think of, such as Homer. Mm-hmm. We know almost nothing of him. And so the question is not, did Jesus Christ live? That's not the question. The question is, who or what was he?
Yeah.
Yep.
So is he a man who was lying, or was he insane and claimed things? Or was he telling the truth? Because those are the only three possibilities.
Yeah. Was it the trilemma of C.S. Lewis there? Is he a liar, a lunatic, or...
Yeah, but that goes back much before Lewis. But yes, it's not a new thing, but it's been around a long time.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I can deal with that. And now, in that 6-month period, no human being was guiding me. I didn't know at the time, but I look back at it now and say, well, the Holy Spirit was guiding me. But no human being would say, oh, you got to do this and do that and read this and so forth. And so in the Bible for the first time, I realized that the Gospels, the four Gospels, are legal depositions. You could take the four Gospels into a court of law and prove the existence of Jesus Christ. These are four eyewitness accounts, legal depositions. And these are the things they saw, that they were recorded, etc. And then you have these outside historians that, again, establish the existence outside. Mm-hmm. You know, there was a time when people said Pontius Pilate never lived. And then we found the record of him at Caesarea Maritima. Yeah. But we have found his name since then, too. And so Pilate existed.
Yeah.
And the denial of it is simply wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked at all this, and at the end of 6 months, I came to the realization that Jesus was telling the truth, that he's exactly who he said he was. And the final proof in that context was that 500 people were willing to die on a cross and not recant that they had seen him after the resurrection. Now, no one will voluntarily die to support a lie.
Right.
Now, I do want to say that there have been good people who died to support a lie, but they didn't do it voluntarily. Example, there were good, even Christian, German soldiers in World War II. You would say they were supporting Hitler because they were fighting, but the fact of the matter is they were coerced. You know, they knew if they didn't fight, their families would suffer.
Yeah. Okay.
And so they didn't do it voluntarily, and they even knew it was wrong. I mean, even Rommel, who was trying to help kill Hitler at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And so no one will willingly, knowingly die to support a lie, you know. And if over 500 people were willing to suffer the death on the cross, which is absolutely gruesome, and would not recant that they had seen him after the resurrection, for me, that just kind of sealed it.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
But what that did was, in a room by myself, again, nobody there except the Holy Spirit, I made the commitment as a Christian.
Wow. That's so cool.
That is.
Well, thank you. I think it was a pretty unique event.
Yeah.
I knew so little about Christianity, though, that after I had made that commitment, I made an appointment with a associate pastor of a large church. And he was kind enough to allow me to come in and visit with him and so forth. And I said, okay, here's the deal. And I gave him the story. And I looked at him and said, is there anything else I need to do? You know, I'm a scientist.
Yeah.
A scientist expects a checklist at the back of the book.
Yeah.
You're going to launch a rocket, you want a checklist.
Sure.
And, you know, you're going to take off a fighter plane from an aircraft carrier. You want a checklist.
Yeah.
And there's no checklist.
Yeah, you're just trying to figure out what in the world am I doing now, huh?
So while I'd made the commitment, again, I knew so little about it that I made this appointment. He was kind enough to accept. And I went into his office and explained my situation. And then I looked at him and said, is there anything else I need to do? Now, he looked at me and he said, is your decision firm? And I said, well, if you knew me, you wouldn't ask that question. Mm-hmm. Because he didn't know me.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think he'd ever had that response. So, you know, and that kind of took him back a little bit. You know how people sit back in the seat a little bit when somebody says something that's kind of foreign to them?
Yeah.
And he thought about it for a second. And he said, okay. And he opened up the Bible and he says, you need to make it perfect. And he showed me. And I said, fair enough. He opened up the Bible and he said, you need to be baptized in water. And he showed me scriptures.
Yep.
And I said, fair enough. And so the next Sunday, I walked down an aisle just to make it public.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And was baptized in water shortly after that. But that meant that I had a huge problem. Now I'll ask you guys, can you figure out what my problem was? Apparently not.
Yeah.
That just made me a saved evolutionist.
A saved evolutionist.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now that's a problem.
Yeah.
You know, how can you teach evolution at its purest level, which is atheism,
Right.
and have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe?
Right.
As we say in Russia, that's a problem. That's a problem.
That's an opposite direction there.
I say that because I'm a missionary and I went to Russia 59 times before the war started. And, but I'm smart enough to know I got a problem.
Yeah.
Right.
So I said, okay. And so I spent 16 more months reevaluating science from scratch. I started with a fresh piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
I did not allow what I had learned and taught others and so forth to influence me. I just started with a blank piece of paper. I looked at scientific law, natural process, physical evidence. Now, I knew the physical evidence real well. I mean, if you're going to be in paleontology, you got a good idea what's in the ground. And so for 16 months, I studied those things. Now, first of all, to have a law, you have to have a lawgiver. If there's no lawgiver, there is no law.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the laws of science, they're not like a law in society. You know, we have a law in society. Let's say that I'm going down the highway out here.
Yep.
It's 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The speed limit's 55 miles an hour. I'm doing 75,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 95. And there's a red light or a stop sign, and I just blow right through that thing. If there's no cop there to catch me and give me a ticket, if I don't hit anything, if I don't harm anybody, you know, I can break the law and get away with it in society. You know, that's possible to break a law in society and get away with it.
Really?
Really?
I think I've seen that before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But in science, that's not the case.
Yeah.
In science, a law is immutable. Now, everybody's familiar with, you know, law of gravity. Maybe the laws of motion or thermodynamics or heat, whatever. But at the end of 16 months of looking at that, I'll tell you, I asked myself one last question. But in looking at the laws, you've got to have a lawgiver. And the laws in science are immutable.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at natural process. Now, no process is of any value unless it's whole and complete. And let's take a look at the example of, say, photosynthesis. I think everybody pretty much knows about photosynthesis from school.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that this is how light energy is turned into food, basically. But if you remove one step, the whole thing doesn't work. Now, that means that it has to come into existence whole and complete. It could not have evolved into being what it is. Mm-hmm. And this applies to life every which way. When you were in school, you learned the method by which you got the best grades because you want to get the best grades, right?
Right.
You could say that a little stronger, right?
Right.
They say, you know,
Yeah.
Did you want good grades, man?
Yes.
that. So, but everybody has a different method by which they learn best. So you read it once, you got it. Or you read it 3 times, you got it. Or you have to read it out loud because you got to hear it because you're an audio learner. Or you've got to see it in pictures because if you could, as a visual learner, if you see it in pictures, then you got it. Right? But there's some method that you use to get the best grades. If you don't follow that method, you don't get as good grades, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So no process is of any value unless it's whole and complete. Now, when you take a look at photosynthesis, it could not possibly have evolved. And it is responsible for something in the areas of 98, 99% of all life on Earth existing. Now, there are a few life forms that don't require photosynthesis to exist, but most stuff does. And so without photosynthesis, life on Earth would be radically different. And it would be, well, it would be down to just some microbes. Well, when you start taking a look at the natural processes, if I were to explain to you for a moment the cascade of chemical events that occurs, this cascade of chemical chain, just to start and initiate a human birth, what has to happen? Just to initiate it, not complete it, just to initiate it. It's unbelievable. If you were just, I mean, you cut yourself, you got, blood clot that seals it up, right? Mm-hmm. And you can get a scab. I'd like you to think about something. First of all, where'd that come from? How did blood, what chemical process which is required stop the bleeding? Here's the next question. What stopped the stop? See, when the blood comes to the surface and there's chemical reactions that occur, what stops it from continuing to clot? Because after it starts to clot, then technically it ought to continue to clot and you'd go solid after your first cut.
Yeah.
You ever thought about that one?
No.
Nope.
So there had to be a process that made it clot, but then to stop it from clotting too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you just clot till you were just a solid, stiff mass.
Yeah, I can say I've never thought about it like that before.
Well, that's just it. Most people don't. You just take it for granted.
Right.
You know, it's been happening since birth and you just accept it.
Yeah.
Right? But these chemical cascades, and another one that we use, but there are literally millions of them as examples. But another one, say, is the bombardier beetle. There's a slightly over 500 species of bombardier beetle on Earth. They're about an inch long or shorter. Inside their body, they have chambers. Inside the chambers, they make hydrogen peroxide. You can put that on wounds, or you can bleach your hair with it.
Yeah. I've done that before.
You have?
Yeah.
My goodness.
There's a few pictures out there.
Yeah. But they also make an aqueous benzoquinone chemical. But if these two touch, it would cause an explosion. So there are enzymes that are there to prevent this from occurring. They're reducing enzymes. So this beetle can carry these chemicals around, make them in these chambers, carry them around, but it's benign because it has these enzymes to stop the explosion.
Wow.
But when it's attacked, it doesn't occur inside the body. The beetle says, I'm being attacked. And then it squeezes these things out at 500 times per second.
Wow.
Once outside the body, it adds oxidative enzymes to the mix. That causes a reaction that produces a temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The water left over from the hydrogen peroxide turns to steam.
Yeah.
It then uses scalding hot steam to spray aqueous benzoquinones, which are toxic, say, against an ant or something that's attacked this beetle. And the beetle walks away. Not only that, when it squeezes them out through, if you think of a gun turret like on a ship with two barrels, it has these two, guns, and it can point them in any direction it wants to against this creature.
Wow.
My first question is, how many beetles did they blow up on the launch pad before they got that right?
Yeah.
It shows obvious design by a master chemist.
Yeah, you just can't build something like that.
Yeah.
No.
Even a master chemist, if they didn't know anything about the process that already existed in nature and was asked to come up with that, would struggle, at least initially.
For sure.
Yeah.
So we see obvious design in nature. And again, when you see design, it requires a designer.
Yeah.
And so Paul makes this wonderful argument in Romans chapter 1. He writes a letter to the evolutionists, starts at Romans 1:16. And he talks about how every human being knows that God exists. Even the most, militant of atheists, even Richard Dawkins, knows that God exists. He's just not willing to admit it.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses what's called the argument by design. Now, 400 years later, St. Augustine of Hippo would say that this is one of the 5 classical arguments for the existence of God. It is perhaps the single strongest one, because when you see design, you know there's a designer. So this table, when you see it, you know this didn't come about by random chance.
Right.
You know somebody made it, that there's a table maker.
Yeah, we know who made this table.
Yep. There you go.
We had somebody that made this table for us. So, yeah.
Well, and this phone didn't come about by random chance.
Right.
Somebody designed it. Somebody made it. Not necessarily the same person, but there's the designer. There was the assembler, etc., to make it. And when you look at it, you're driving down the street, and let's say you see a building, maybe it's a government office building, whatever, and you've never been inside. But just driving down the street, what do you know? You know there was an architect, you know there was a building contractor, you know there were building people, and you know that there was a building permit people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Unfortunately.
let's get exactly. Let's get realistic. If you live in Michigan, you know there's building permit people.
Yeah.
And so you know all those things intrinsically, and yet you've never been in the building. And I live in Orlando, Florida. That's Hollywood East. It could be a clever Hollywood set. It could just be walls with nothing inside. But whether it's a real building or not, somebody built it, somebody designed it, somebody painted it to make it look like a building, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so God has given the human mind the intrinsic ability to recognize design versus randomness. And so when you see just stones on the ground, it's kind of random. But if you were to see them stacked on each other, you would know somebody put them there, because it requires intelligence and energy to put stones on top, one on the other, that they didn't crawl up there by themselves. And so we have the intrinsic ability to recognize design versus randomness. God gave us that talent, every human being. Well, when you take a look at the natural laws and realize there has to be a lawgiver and that they could not possibly evolve from something less, you take a look at natural process and realize that no process could come into existence by an evolutionary process. And you take a look at the physical evidence. Now, there's two kinds of ways to look at what's in the ground. One of them is called historical geology, and that's the evolutionist view. And so they take a look at what's in the ground. They build their theory of how the structures in the ground, the layers and the mountains and the valleys, and they come up with their interpretation of how that came into existence through an evolutionary lens, and say that it takes millions and billions of years.
Mm-hmm.
It's all just random chance. The other is to look at it from what's called flood geology.
Okay.
And that refers specifically to Noah's flood.
Yeah.
But even the evolutionists will tell you and agree that all those layers, I challenge people, whenever you go anywhere where there are road cuts. Now, I realize that in some places the land's really flat and you don't really see the road cuts there. But if you go through hills or mountains or wherever it might be, always, always, always look in the road cuts and see these layers there. Now, don't look too long if you're driving. Okay.
Yeah.
If you don't look long, stop. But if you look at those layers, now the evolutionary concept is these layers came about one at a time, slowly, gradually, over millions and billions of years.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really stop and take a look, you're going to find out that sure, there are layers, places where the layers are flat. Agreed. But if you look, even in a relatively short distance, typically a quarter, half a mile or so, you'll actually see that some of them undulate.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them actually turn like so. But you can't bend rock. It'll break. But you can bend mud.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you see these undulations, and many times you'll also see where there's an undulation and yet there's a shearing here with flat layers, but there's curved layers under it, or maybe be above it or whatever. Stop and ask yourself a question. Wait a minute. That cannot happen while those layers were solid. It had to happen while they were still mud. So they had to be folded while they were still mud and then dry out. Well, that would be consistent with a flood geology view.
Yeah.
So in geology, there's the historical geology,
which
is evolutionist, which says this takes millions and billions of years. But the contradictions to that are massive.
Yeah.
So we might talk more about that. But then there's the flood geology. And the question is, which of the two better gives you what you see?
Fits the evidence.
And the evidence fits the flood geology, vastly superior.
Yeah.
To anything in historical. And there's a lot of other reasons too.
Yeah. So Noah's flood is really paramount to, what we're talking about here. And of course, that would be fun to talk about for a few minutes. So the Bible makes a very clear account of a worldwide flood, and we call it Noah's flood, of course. But why is that in other ways so pivotal in understanding or lining up better with evidence than the evolutionist theory or theories
Yeah,
of what's
theories.
going on.
And
Yeah, just to kind of elaborate on the
the
impact
flood,
of
the
Noah's
flood,
flood.
of course, had tremendous impact on the surface of the earth. And in my illustration of my own testimony here,
Okay.
in paleontology and so forth, I had studied these things and studied the fossils in the ground and so forth. But did you ever go out and dig in the ground? And let me preface this: you were in, say, high school, maybe college, maybe you took a class in geology, just as a single class, whatever. And you had all these textbooks from the time that you started kindergarten to the time you got out of high school or college telling you that evolution was true and that these layers were, laid down one at a time over millions and billions of years. Please tell me, after you got out of school, did you ever go out and dig in the ground to see whether or not they were telling you the truth?
No, I never have.
You never did, right? Well, in one sense of the word, I didn't either until I got college and out of college and so forth.
Okay.
But when you look at those layers and you see them in the textbook, and they'll say, oh, this is the order of the layers.
Yeah.
And maybe there's illustrations on the side. These are different creatures that lived at the different times that
I've
these
seen
layers
those
supposedly
pictures.
form, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the typical, it's called the geological time scale or the geological column. And it is the Bible of evolutionists. That's their Bible. That these layers are in the ground and there are fossils in, not every one of them, but there's fossils everywhere in the world in these layers. And that this is how it happened, and these are the times in which they happened. The Carboniferous period, 300, 360, the Silurian, the age of fishes at 360 to 410, and they teach you these things. Now, again, you'd like to think that your teachers wouldn't lie to you,
Yeah.
but they will. If you will go out and dig in the ground, you're going to find out there is nowhere in the world that all those layers exist in one place in that order. Nowhere. That is a deceptive construction. What the evolutionist does is this. The evolutionist takes a layer from India and a layer from Canada and a layer from Europe and a layer from the United States, and then they rearrange the layers in the order they want them.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And then once they have rearranged the layers, then they claim proof. Now, that is a totally deceptive, dishonest methodology. In the Greeks, developing the science of logic, said that this is a tautology that falls on its own weight. That you cannot take evidence, rearrange it, and then claim proof.
Right.
It's self-serving, circular reasoning.
Hmm.
The single greatest difference scientifically between the evolutionary scientist I used to be and the creation scientist I am is that we don't rearrange the evidence. That whatever we find, we assume is consistent with the Creator God. But the evolutionist has to rearrange the evidence before they claim proof, and that is a monstrous difference. I mean, monstrous. Now, you will find a few layers here or a few layers there that are in the order that evolutionists would claim. But it doesn't exist anywhere in a total column anywhere in the world. And the inconsistencies, see, they say the layers are in this order. But what you'll find is that 75 to 80% of the Earth's dry land surface is covered with dried out wet mud layers called sedimentary rock, and many containing fossils. But that's what you find. But the layers are not in that order. That they're upside down. They're missing. In the Grand Canyon, maybe you've been there, but you've certainly seen pictures.
Yep.
In the Grand Canyon, evolutionists say, well, this represents 500 million years of gradual and slow accumulation over time. Fact of the matter is, there's 160 million missing, according to them. There's only 340 million there, and they are not always in the order that evolutionists claim. And there's a place on the North Kaibab Trail. If you go up the North Kaibab Trail, that's the high side, there's a place on the trail where you can stop and back up, but don't go very far. And look at this wall in front of you, okay? And you will actually see a sedimentary rock layer, so that's dried out mud. Sedimentary rock is just a big word for dried out mud.
Okay.
And it's almost circular. Not quite, but close to circular. And it's surrounded by a different kind of dried out mud, kind of like a donut or a bagel, right? And then that is surrounded by the same that's in the middle. Well, that ain't one layer at a time.
Yeah.
And like I say, they're missing, they're upside down, backwards. But other things, think with me. If these layers were slow, gradual, one at a time, if that were true, then think there would be a time between each layer forming. So you'd get a layer, and then a while later you'd get another layer. And this is sedimentary rock, which requires water. So you have to have floods to get sedimentary rock, to get dried out mud. Well, first of all, you would have to believe that, in many places, the layers being the same thickness in a lot of places, that you'd have to have 100,000 floods, all the same depth, covering literally hundreds of thousands of square miles that occurred exactly the same way, one after the other, which stretches credulity. And again, I mentioned waving and bending. But if these layers were laid down one at a time, then the layer would be exposed before the next layer came on top. If that's true, then please tell me, why are there no soil horizons in between? Certainly, if the layers were laid down one at a time, some of that, dried out mud would have weathered, and we'd have soil horizons before we got the next layer. Why are there no V-shaped erosion marks? Because if a layer is exposed, you're going to get rain, you're going to get the etching of water eroding, and you're going to get a V-shaped erosion mark. Now, that would be filled in by the next layer and preserved.
Okay.
Don't find them.
Yeah.
Why are there no animal holes? Why are there no root holes? You see, in science...
It just doesn't add up.
Well, in science and in Bible study, I want to point that out. In science and Bible studies, it's interesting when a scientist becomes a theologian. But the two greatest questions in science are the two greatest questions in theology. So a good scientist always asks two questions. First of all, what is there? So that when I make an observation, I have to adequately describe what is present, what is there. But the other question, which is more important, is what's not there.
Yeah.
And we learn more by asking the second question than the first. And the same thing is true of Bible studies. I can show you wonderful examples of why what is there and what is not there are critically important.
Yeah.
So when you see that there's no soil horizons, there's no V-shaped erosion marks, there's no animal holes, there's no root holes, it tells you that this is all laid down at the same time.
Yeah.
By one really big flood. Now, research that has been done at sedimentation laboratories at Colorado State University and also in France now have proven layers do not form one on top of the other slowly and gradually. That when water flows, and even in a vacuum, in air, what happens is the layers all form at the same time and simply extend in the direction of water flow. And so what happens is, if I can use my hand, what happens is the front is kind of, diagonal here, but the layers are being laid down at the same time behind it.
Okay.
Okay, so this moving diagonal front. And therefore, the layer at the bottom is the same age as the layer at the top. The one on the top isn't younger.
Yeah.
They're all the same age.
Yeah.
So once I had looked at law, once I'd looked at natural process, which I had reevaluated the physical evidence. And again, there's other consistencies like polystrate fossils, typically tree trunks, but they can be bone. But this is a fossil which penetrates more than one layer, polystrate. Poly, many, straight, strata, layers.
Okay.
And so you'll find tree trunks. Any coal miner will back this up. You get tree trunks and going through more than one layer, but don't have a top, don't have a bottom. They're just logs.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're upside down. So ask yourself a question. How could that tree exist growing upside down without tops or bottoms for millions of years while those layers formed around it?
Yeah. Right.
Impossible.
Right. Yeah.
We have human artifacts in layers that, according to evolutionists, could be up to 500 million years.
Yeah.
We have all these things. So at the end of 16 months, I came to the realization that there is no scientific proof for evolution whatsoever. It's a fairy tale for adults. It's a house of cards. You remove one card, the whole thing falls.
Yeah. Wow. So that kind of brings up one of the bigger, topics around this is the age of the earth, So let's talk about that. You have a totally different mindset now in terms of the age of the earth than you did when you're 27, 26 years old.
Or 19 or
19, yeah, based
12.
based on what you just said. If all of these things happened at once with this flood and the evidence is overwhelmingly backing that, it doesn't seem like a theory to us. We don't believe it's a theory. We believe it's the biblical truth. And then evolution, everything that they're trying to patch together just doesn't work. It doesn't fit. So how does that affect your understanding of the age of the earth, and how would you explain that?
Well, again, growing up as an evolutionist, I just memorized what they taught me. I wasn't educated. I was indoctrinated. However, in the 16-month process that I underwent when I changed completely, the big word is geochronometer. But I love taking $5 scientific words and making 25 cents out of them. Geochronometer. Geo means earth or matter.
Okay.
The ancient word for that.
Yeah.
Just like geography, geology. So geo is just earth, matter. And chronometer is just the big word for a clock. Right?
Yeah.
When they try to sell you a Rolex, they call it a chronometer. They sell you a Timex, it says it keeps time. But geochronometer just means Earth time clock or universe time clock.
Okay.
And so these are the scientific clocks that allow you to determine how old something is, or to put it more correctly, a geochronometer does not tell you how old something is. A geochronometer says it can be up to this amount, but no more.
Okay.
And so a geochronometer, now today we have 450 plus. You go to my website, I have articles, we've got books available, but I have 450 short videos, a minute here, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. And most of them deal with young earth arguments. These are the minor ones, because the major ones we have in videos and books.
Yeah.
And they're easy to understand.
Okay.
Thanks. But some of the more minor ones, I've got all these little short, if you want to learn about them, they're there.
Yeah.
And
So
it's for free.
what is your email address, just for our listeners to be able to check that out?
Well, the website is Creation Worldview, VIEW.org.
Okay.
And there's over 100 free articles. Like I say, there's 450 free short videos. And then there's the bookstore if you want to really get some education. But a geochronometer says, based on this particular criteria, it could be up to that old, but no more. And so, for example, this is an argument that was used by Lord Kelvin 150 years ago in England. Lord Kelvin and the Kelvin temperature gradient and so forth.
Okay.
And because he was interested in heat, and we know the Earth is losing more heat every day than it gets from the sun. And this is quite intentional, We're in the Goldilocks zone, as it's referred to, in distance from the sun, where our planet could have life. If you're closer, you burn. You're farther away, you freeze. Mm-hmm. So we're in what's called the Goldilocks zone. But we radiate more heat than we get every day because you're sitting on top of a big, hot rock. Around here in the summer, you like to do barbecue outside, and you get the coals out, and you get the coals started, and they turn red, and some turn white.
Yep.
If you were to take tongs and take that white hot coal out of the pit and put it over by itself, just by itself, what's going to happen?
Yeah, it's going to cool off over time.
That's right. It's going to radiate heat, cool off, and go stone cold to the center, right? Well, the Earth is exactly the same way. Now, the center of the Earth is 13,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's one reason we're never going.
Yeah.
Not even at night. And they may have caffeine around here for these guys.
I'll drink some right now.
There you go. And so the Earth radiates more heat than we get from the sun. Now, God put it there knowing that where we are from the sun, if we got all the heat we needed to live from the sun, that would be detrimental. So we have the sunlight coming in at a proper rate for life, but he put all that heat down there so that you're not alive because of the heat coming from the sun. You're alive because of the heat coming from the sun and the heat passing by you on the way out.
Mm.
Well, that means the Earth is cooling off. And so this is really simple. Lord Kelvin made the calculation, and it's a good calculation today. If, I said if, but if the Earth were even 40 million years old, the Earth would have gone stone cold to the center. But evolutionists say the Earth is 5 billion years old.
What was that number again? 14. What did you say? 14 billion?
No,
or million?
40 million.
40 million.
40 million years.
Wow.
And so
I've never heard that before.
So the Earth couldn't possibly be old enough for what evolutionists claim.
Yeah.
But the same thing is true in other places. The moon is still losing heat. Now, just a good idea of the difference in size between the Earth and the moon. If the Earth were represented by a basketball, the moon would be a softball. That's a very good comparison.
Okay.
But the moon, being much smaller, would lose heat much faster from the time that it came into existence. I didn't say evolution or creation, but when it came into existence. Well, if it was not even 40 million, but far less, it should have already gone stone cold. But we know that the moon is still radiating heat. The moon is moving away at 1.5 inches per year. That limits the system to 1.4 billion years. There's too much dust in the solar system. If it were as old as they said it is, the sun, with 98% of all the gravity, should have sucked it out of space and into the sun, or the planets or the moons would have by gravity.
Wow.
But there's too much dust. The sun is still rotating. Well, if it was as old as they say it is, it should have stopped rotating. We have lumpy rings around planets. Saturn is not the only planet with rings. All 4 gas giants have rings. Now, when I said they've got lumpy rings, that's okay. What does that mean? Well, you've all seen a pool table. You've all seen billiard balls. And somebody hits the white ball and it gets up against the 8 ball, and things move, right?
Yep.
Now, if you hit it really fast, it hits this one and the white stops and the other one just goes flying, right?
Right.
But if you hit it slowly, it rolls up against one, and this one accelerates, but this one continues to decelerate, right?
Yep.
Well, rings are millions and billions of rock and ice particles, but the rings are still lumpy, all of them. And so what that tells you is that they're young. Because if these particles had been bouncing back and forth like billiard balls for millions and billions of years, then they should have smoothed out. All those collisions would have slowed up and speeded up, and they'd reach an average.
Okay.
But they're lumpy, which means they haven't been old enough to do that yet. And the rings are disappearing. When you take a look at the satellite photographs that were taken by Voyager, and you take a look at the recent photographs taken by, say, Hubble, there are rings around Uranus that are going to cease to exist within 100 years.
Wow.
And what's happening to the rings? Well, if the rings are on the inside, the planet's gravity is pulling them into the planet, and they're disappearing. If they're on the outer side of the ring, by centrifugal force, they're being thrown out into space, and the rings are stretching, and they're disappearing.
Yeah.
And there are 2 rings around Uranus that are really interesting because they're actually stood around each other this way. Well, that sure doesn't fit the evolutionary concepts. We found, of course, that there are moons, such as Io, that have volcanic activity. The most volcanic object in the solar system is Io. So that means it's got heat, but it's so small that it should be stone cold long ago. We found the same thing with Pluto. When we flew by Pluto, and boy, did we go by it fast, but we got some really good photos. And there's been recent volcanic activity on Pluto. Now, it's so far from the sun that it would be like a pinpoint in the distance to see the sun. Gets almost no heat whatsoever from the sun. And that there are ice mountains. Think of the Rocky Mountains. Think of the Sierras of California. These ice mountains are sharp-pointed, like teeth. But if you know anything about ice, and I think you do in this area, certainly.
Yeah, definitely.
You know that ice sublimes, that over time, ice flows. So you open up a refrigerator, freezer door, and you see two ice cubes that are melting together in temperatures below 32, right? So ice will still flow even at sub-zero temperatures or sub-freezing temperatures. If the ice mountains on Pluto were as old as evolutionists claim, they should have flowed to the bottom. But they're still tall and sharp, which means they're young. If you go across the galaxy, you go across the universe, we find barred spiral galaxies. Now, you've seen pictures of beautiful spiral galaxies, I know, but they're different kinds of galaxies. One's called irregular, so it's a mass of stars, but it doesn't have a curve, it doesn't have a structure, so to speak, just kind of a random bunch of stars. And then you've got spiral galaxies, and you've got barred spiral galaxies. So spiral galaxies are turning. And if you anybody can get on the internet, just thousands of free photos from NASA and so on. And you see these beautiful spiral galaxies. But here's the problem. We see barred spiral galaxies. Two things. If the spiral galaxies were as old as people say, then the arm should have broken off. Because the farther out the star, the longer it takes to get around. So if it starts to rotate, then it gets that curve shape. But a barred spiral galaxy, and our galaxy, which is the Milky Way, has a short bar across the center. So when you see these barred spiral galaxies, what you see is a bar of millions, maybe even billions of stars, and then a twist at the end.
Okay.
So you know it's turning. So you see the curve, straight curve. You know it's rotating. But if it rotates more than 1/8 of one turn, the bar wouldn't be straight. It'd be curved, which means that those galaxies haven't had enough time to go even 1/8 of one turn because you still got a straight line. And we have a short bar across ours. It doesn't go all the way across, but many galaxies do. And so these are just simple, easy to understand little geochronometers. And the flood is another one. We only have 4,500 years worth of mud at the mouth of all the world's great rivers. Now, if you take a look at the, quote, source of all wisdom and knowledge, Wikipedia, and believe me, that's really tongue-in-cheek, they say the Mississippi is 2 million years old. But there's only 4,500 years worth of mud at the mouth.
Right.
In the Gulf of America.
Just doesn't add up. Yeah. So you have all these geochronometers, right, that you just listed. So
But that's just some of the easy ones.
Yeah. So there's just, like you said, there's all kinds of them, and none of them line up with an old Earth, but a young creation, right? So how old would you say that creation is?
Well, first of all, undoubtedly, it's about 6,000 years old.
Okay.
I mean, that was easier to say in the year 2000. So what am I going to say now? 6,025?
Right.
But when we take a look in the Bible which should be our master authority, God's word, you take a look at the genealogy of Mary in Luke. Goes back to David, goes back to Adam, the son of God. Clearly, that's 6,000 years. Period. But one of the geochronometers, and I think it's the number one out of 450, frankly, but if not, it's in the top 10. is the decay of the Earth's magnetic field.
Okay.
Now, it is simple. It's not complex. The Earth's magnetic field is decaying the same way that a radioactive material decays. Now, the Earth has a magnetic field, and when you were in school, they might have taught you that maybe you thought it just was there, functioning. But it takes energy to keep that field going. And so what happens is, over time, to maintain the field, you have to use energy out of it. And so the field is getting less and less. It's shrinking. It's getting smaller and smaller.
Okay.
Now, it's part of the reason that people used to live to be 900 years old. It protects us from deadly radiation from the sun or galactic radiation from outside. It helps us stabilize chromosomes. It does good things to us.
Okay.
Yep.
But it's weakening, getting smaller and smaller, and really fast. The half-life is 1,400 years. Now, we've been able to measure it accurately. We've got solid scientific data for years.
Okay.
And based on the loss that we can measure, it's a half-life of 1,400. Now, 200 years on 14 is a big amount of data. When you think about, say, the decay of radioactive materials, and they say, oh, well, this thing has a 4.5 billion year half-life,
Yeah.
and we've only been able to measure it for 100.
Yeah, that's nothing.
So when we say 200 out of 1,400, we've got a really good data set.
Yeah, like 1/7 worth of the life is viewable.
As opposed to infinitesimal.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And so what would happen if we go back in time? Well, if we go back in time, you're going to double the strength every 1,400 years.
Right.
So today, and I don't want to get into what the value means, but today the value is measured at 0.6. Okay?
Okay.
So if you go back every 1,400 years, you'll double, right?
Yep.
So if you were to go back to the year 600, it would be 1.6, right? But let's think about the value that would be important to us as Christians, historically important to us as Christians. So first of all, let's go back to the time of Jesus Christ, when he walked the earth. I think that's pretty important, right?
Yeah.
Technically, it's 1.7, but think of it as 1.8 just to make the math easy. So if it's 0.6 now, 2,000 years ago, Jesus walks the earth, and we're 1.8. We're just adding a tiny amount there.
Okay.
Well, that's 3 times stronger, right?
Yeah.
Now, think about that for a second. The Vikings came across the Atlantic all the way to Oklahoma 1,000 years ago using nothing but a lodestone. Now, today, a lodestone kind of lines up, that's a natural magnetic piece of rock, kind of lines up north and south. You can kind of use it as a compass, right?
Okay.
But if you were to have a field that were significantly stronger, it would line up better, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the exploration of, say, the Vikings, we know they were in the central United States 1,200 years ago. But that would have an effect on a lot of things that have to do with iron and iron tools and the development of civilizations. Now, if you go back to the time of Noah's flood, so that's basically 4,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you keep doubling every 1,400 years. That means at the time of Noah and the flood, that it was 10 times greater than today. It would be 6.0. You don't even have to change anything. It works out really nicely.
Okay.
So magnetic field of the earth was 10 times greater at the time of Noah. You go back to the approximate time of creation, that would be 6,000 years ago. The value at 4,000 BC is 20. Well, that could help you navigate. It might have some other benefits. It would help you live longer. But how many, have either of you or anybody in the audience ever had an MRI?
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So that's how we see what you look like on the inside without cutting you open, right?
Yeah.
Which is really neat.
Yeah.
Unless you're sitting in that tube. That's not very neat. But yeah.
Well, I've had like 10, like 10 myself. But you got to admit it's better than cutting you open.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
100% agree.
Whatever. So how does that work? Well, we put your body in this big electromagnet and turn it on, and it allows us through computers and so forth to see what you look like, right? And it's really neat stuff. By the way, that was developed by a Christian creation-believing scientist, Dr. Damadian, who should have won the Nobel Prize, but you can't win a Nobel Prize unless you're an evolutionist.
Interesting.
Okay.
They will not give a Nobel to a Christian creationist. It is only for evolutionists. So that I'd tell you something about anybody who wins one. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But it's really neat technology. But when they put you inside that big electromagnet, they're hitting you with this magnetism and changing it into an image and so on. If you go back just 6,000 years to the time of creation, the Earth's magnetic field was 20 times stronger than today. That's no problem. But if you were to go back a mere 10,000 years, now that would be 2080 plus 8,000 BC, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at 8,000 BC, the value would continue to increase. You go back 10,000 years, the value of the Earth's magnetic field would be technically it's 98, but think of it as 100.
100 times strong.
And think of the 0.6 is just 0.5, just to make the math easy, right?
Yeah.
So if it were 0.5 instead of 0.6, and if it was 100 instead of 98, okay, how many times stronger was the Earth's magnetic field?
200.
Basically, 200 times, right?
Yeah.
When they hit you with that MRI, they didn't hit you with 100 times the magnetic field strength of the Earth, because if they had, when you got, he wouldn't get up. But after the test, they'd wipe you off the wall like ketchup.
Yeah, so we couldn't exist.
Every single cell in your body would be ruptured.
So, yeah.
You've heard of the super collider in Europe, in France and Switzerland?
No, I haven't.
Well, it's the big super collider.
Okay.
Huge magnets to force
particles
to force subatomic particles to fly into each other and so on.
Yeah.
No human can be in that circle with those magnets on it. It would kill them. And they're not even close to being 200 times the Earth's magnetic field. Okay. And so no life on Earth could even possibly exist 8 to 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
That's
wow.
great.
And so what does an evolutionist say when you present these facts to them about just the pure math of these calculations?
Do you want to quote?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't even seem reasonable to continue to promote these lies.
See, Christians and creationism. Creation and Christianity are the only rational, reasonable, logical, and evidence-based things in the world. Evolution is not based in any of them. It is an irrational religion. Yeah. And now the evolutionist has their arguments to try to make up for it, but the knowledgeable evolutionist knows that what I've just said is true. If they know anything about it, they know it's true.
Yeah.
But think about that. According to them, evolution requires, first of all, one continuous process. When you make models of creation and evolution and you make the assumptions, and so you're indirectly testing, one of the parts of the models of creation and evolution, creation says there was a global catastrophe. Evolution says no global catastrophe, because if there were a global catastrophe, you'd have to start over. And so their belief, their religion is one continuous process over millions and billions of years.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, we have the evidence of a worldwide catastrophe. Secondly, you get into arguments like the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, which in my opinion is absolutely irrefutable.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
They will say, for instance, how could this possibly be? And they make up a fairy tale for adults.
Yeah.
They will say, well, yes, the magnetic field is decreasing, and we have reached a point in time where we can measure it. But what happens is, you see, it goes to zero, and then it reverses and builds up again.
So they just make it up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But think of this for a second. If it were to go to zero and no magnetic field, then we'd have no protection from deadly radiation, and we all die.
Yeah.
So it sets the limit in the future, which is not very far. It's one of the actual scientific proofs the Lord's coming back soon. It's not the only one, but it's one of them.
That's pretty exciting.
Which is, I think it is too. Mm-hmm. But the decay of the magnetic field sets a limit. Now, I'm not picking a day. I'm not saying it's next week. But within hundreds of years of time,
Yeah. The Earth will
the
actually
Earth's magnetic field
not-
reaches a point where you're no longer protected, and we'd all
Wow.
fry. Okay,
Yeah.
That's incredible.
That's-
but if you go back in time, you can't get beyond much more than 6,000 years, or we'd die. So
Yeah.
we're living in a short window.
Right.
It's right there. Wow.
If I may make a statement, God never intended the earth to last for a long time once it became imperfect.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he created it perfect, and as perfect, it would continue.
Yeah.
But once there's a flaw, one flaw, the entire universe becomes imperfect, and the decay process starts. So,
Wow.
but God never intended for the creation, specifically the earth, to last for a long time once it became imperfect.
And that's a whole different conversation. But maybe I could just ask you one question. Do you feel that when sin entered
Mhm.
our creation, that everything started to change? Is that
Oh, absolutely. Both biblically and scientifically.
yeah, for sure, biblically,
But Paul says this. He says the
Wow.
entire universe moans and groans, waiting for
Yeah.
restoration, correct?
that's amazing.
Mhm.
What Paul is saying, you have to understand, Greeks, they understood atomic theory. Now, they didn't understand the structure of an atom or that sort of thing, but they understood atomic theory in the sense that you can only get down to a certain point in size for matter to exist, right? So they understood atomic. And what Paul was saying in the Greek was that the farthest atom in the universe from here was affected by the sin of man on earth, that the entire universe moans and groans,
Yeah.
waiting for the restoration.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
And
That's cool.
that blows my mind
Yeah.
thinking about it.
remember, the Bible is a book of history, but it's not only a book of history, but there's accurate history in the Bible. The Bible has tremendous amounts of accurate scientific statements, but it's not a book of only science. It's a
Right,
book
right.
of supernatural truths.
Yeah.
But it has accurate history, and it has wonderful, accurate scientific statements. And so Paul's statement is a valid scientific statement. And
Yeah.
Paul is the first creation evangelist. You know, what I do is I'm following Paul 2,000 years later. But he used, again, science to witness to the Greeks. He writes about this also in Romans chapter 1. He writes about it in Acts 17. And he is introducing people to Christ, but you've got to introduce the Father first, the Creator first. And so he makes the scientific basic defense
Yeah.
of the Father Creator existence so that he can then introduce people to the Son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's awesome.
That-
So, Dr. Grady, going back to your testimony, and then you studied all of these, new evidences and all the things that we've been talking about for a while. So, how did that all finally come to a head for you?
Well, after the 16 months of studying all these things and others, I asked myself one last question. I talked about law, that laws in science are immutable, and everybody knows about some of the laws. But I did ask myself one last question. I said, could the law of gravity ever have evolved?
Hmm.
Now, I've been studying science now for about 75 years. I can think of no way in which gravity could ever have been anything less than it is. It's the universal force in nature that holds the universe together in the natural. There's nowhere in the universe that gravity does not exist. Nowhere. Scientists tell jokes about zero gravity because any scientist would know there's no such thing. Now, the amount of gravity varies. If you're between galaxies, there's microgravity, but gravity always exists. And so could it possibly have evolved into existence? And I can think of no way it could ever be anything less, and therefore it had to come into existence whole and complete as the other laws. I mean, there's a cascade of saying, well, if one had to come into existence whole and complete, it shows that all of them had to be.
Yeah.
But the last one was, could the law of gravity ever have evolved? And the answer was no. And that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
Yeah. That night, I became a biblical scientific creationist.
Wow. That's so cool. I hope that there's someone watching here that can relate to your journey and some of the things that you have discovered and shared with us even today would help them to see What we're
Well,
talking about is the truth, right?
right.
The truth of God's word and the truth of God's creation and the truth of God's love for us and the truth of the gospel.
Yes. And of course, at that point, I had two possibilities. I could either get mad or get even. Now, you don't want to see me mad. And so I decided to get even. And so that's why I've been teaching on this as a teaching missionary, a creation evangelist, whatever term you want, Christian apologist.
Yeah.
For 50 years.
Wow, that's really cool. So you became a Christian, but at the same time, your very response to that was your calling. Well, it changed your whole life.
It was the calling.
Yeah.
And like I said, trying to quote unquote get even. Your greatest testimony comes from your greatest change. If you want to know about the evils of drugs, you find somebody that was on them at one time. Yep. If you want to know the evils of alcohol, you talk to a recovering alcoholic.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, I'm a recovering public school graduate.
I like that.
And so, my greatest change was going from evolution to creation.
Yeah, yeah.
And never going back.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Yeah.
But that was my greatest testimony. So I've been doing that. First, I started working as a missionary domestically, going to various places, mostly churches, but then starting universities and schools and so on, radio, TV. Now, 50 years podcast.
Yeah.
But then, in 1991, I started doing foreign work. And so I try to take 3 to 4 foreign trips every year, plus my domestic work, because I'm a missionary to the U.S. first. We need it the most. But I also do foreign work. So earlier this year, I was in the U.K. doing mission work, and then I went to Kazakhstan. But I teach exactly the same things wherever I am. I'm teaching the truth of creation, the scientific basis for creation, and the biblical as well.
Well, why don't we take a minute to dive into the creation itself? A lot of people wonder in Genesis chapter 1 and following, is this really 7 days as we would know it here on earth, 7 24-hour days that God created everything, or is there some other possibilities there? So why don't you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, if you believe in biblical inerrancy and you would read the word in the English translation day, you'd think day. The Hebrew word is yom. Now, it's used just a little over 2,100 times in the Old Testament. And it does have different nuances, all right?
Okay.
So that it is the common, normal, ordinary word for a 24-hour day. It has other nuances, but it can be used in the past, such as in my Father's day.
Okay.
Or it can be used in the future, such as the day of the Lord, the day of Jacob's trouble. Or it's the word for the 6th feast of the Old Testament, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. But every time it's used, those would be specific times, right? My father lived at a certain time. The Day of the Lord will be a certain time. Yom Kippur is the date on the Jewish calendar, the same every year.
Yeah.
The 10th day of Tishri. Nowhere can this word in Hebrew be used to describe epochs, eras, eons, millions and billions of years with an indefinite end and
definite period of time. Right. Okay.
So that's the word that's used. Secondly, God says it's a day. Now, if you just believe God, it's a day. He uses numbers. It's day 1, day 2, day 3.
Yep.
That is the way you talk about specific days. And the 6 days of creation, 1 day of, quote, rest, although that's totally misunderstood, that word. It's not rest, actually. But it's very specific that God did all these things. Now, the problem that most people have, especially Christians that become Christians, is I can't believe God did all those things in 24 hours. He says he created the sun, moon, and stars all on day 4, And they'll say, I just can't believe he. Well, if you can't believe that, you got a small God. That's just to start with.
Yep.
You've got a weak God. You don't know, El Shaddai, the Almighty God, who can do it simply by saying this. But I understand the initial reaction. I'm sympathetic. that we do in our human thinking say, well, how can he do all that in one day? I get it. I can allow for that.
Yeah.
But if we're going to be Bible-believing Christians and in the inerrancy of Scripture, then what we need to lovingly help those that have those doubts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Now, there are Christians who believe that these days are millions and billions of years, the day-age theory, the framework theory, the allegory theory, or there's a related one called the gap theory, although it was originally called the ruin restoration theory. So there are people who come up with these various theories to try to accommodate evolutionary time into the Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
All right? But that's, first of all, starts with a lack of faith. It really does.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, I mean, I know that I'm in a position at this point, having been doing this for 50 years. But most people say, how can you do it all in one day? At this point in my life, I look back and say, why did it take so long? I truly believe that in the first 5 days of creation, not day 6, but on the first 5 days of creation, God could have done everything he did in 1 second.
Yep.
That he could have gone and then waited 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds for the next day, and then because that is the kind of God we serve. He is sovereign, awesome, which I think is a word that we should use much more often than we do. He's the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnijudicious God.
Amen.
That when he speaks, it simply happens. And so today I would say, why did it take so long? But I had to do a lot of work and mental adjustment to get to that point.
Yeah, well, I think just listening to some other things that you were sharing with us, faith, it's not as hard to have faith when you start to learn more and more about all the facts and all those things build up in you. And I think, we were talking during the break that the more that we live, the more that we see the Scriptures being reinforced over and over and over
Absolutely.
again. Every archaeological find and scientific discovery and all these things just keep strengthening our faith, and it becomes easier to believe in God. I think the older you get, because there's just, you can't deny it.
That's a matter of education. That's a matter of learning. We are all ignorant. It's not a bad word. We're all ignorant of a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
But the more we learn, the more that these things are understandable and become sort of automatic in our faith. Now, you never replace faith with facts, but we have a facts-based faith. And so the more you learn about the facts, the easier the faith is and the stronger the faith is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so in talking about what these days actually mean, so I was talking about, of course, what the word means, but let's take a look at how you can defend the days of creation as being basically 24-hour days. Now, a day is never exactly 24 hours, but we'll call it that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one rotation of the earth. God says it's one period of darkness, one period of light, it's one rotation. So that ought to be easy.
Yeah.
And the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to age of the earth and that these days are days just as we experience today. Jesus Christ said, Adam and Eve were there at the beginning. Jesus did not say they came along millions and billions of years later. But the greatest defense of these days, as 24-hour type days that we experience today, is if you go to the book of the Exodus, chapter 20.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to Exodus chapter 20, God is giving the 10 Commandments. Now, this issue is so important to God and to me personally. In my own book, I spent nearly 4 pages putting every single definition of the word Yom from the world's 2 largest Hebrew lexicons and just listed them.
Mm-hmm.
So that you could see it can never be an era, an eon, an epoch of millions and billions of years. But it's so important to God that in the middle of the giving of the 10 Commandments, he stops.
Right.
Exodus 20, maybe you won't have it, but verses 8 to 11. In essence, he says, you shall work 6 days and rest 1 because I did. And he equates the days that we experience to the days of creation and his work.
Right. Yeah. Did you want me to read it?
Sure.
So it's Exodus 20, verse
8 to 11.
8 to 11. So it says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
And so he equates the days of creation with the days that we live, and says they're the same. They're 24-hour days, one rotation of the earth for each day. I don't think you could get any better definition there.
Right.
Yeah, just reading that sentence in Genesis 1, it's God is just defining it, where it says, I think it's verse 5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day.
And
So
in
he's
the Hebrew,
defining what that word is when it's being spoken for the first time. It's evening, and it's light.
God doesn't define things the way we do. We think of midnight to midnight, 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, the day starts in darkness.
Yeah.
And ends in light.
Yep.
So even the rotation of the earth teaches a biblical truth. Because when we all get here, we get here in darkness.
Yeah.
But if we come to know him, we'll end in light. So
Yeah.
even the rotation of the earth
Yeah.
is a biblical typology of salvation.
Yeah. We think of our day when the sun rises, it starts, but in the biblical, the first thing is evening and then morning.
Exactly. And God did that purposefully.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's the biblical typology of just the rotation of the earth alone teaches a biblical truth. And I mentioned the seventh day is misunderstood. It's the day of rest, it's Shabbat or Sabbath. But when it says God rested, he wasn't tired.
Yeah, right.
Right. And so people misunderstand what Shabbat really means. What Shabbat refers to is this, as we read in Exodus, in the Old Testament economy, and I want to stress the Old Testament economy, you would work 6 days laboring in the physical labor of the secular world, etc., but never forgetting the supernatural. That was always part of your life. So you would work 6 days primarily in the natural, but never forgetting the supernatural. Be ready to pray at any time, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the Jew wears the yarmulke or kippah, more technically correct kippah, the talit, the prayer shawl, even when they're working. So at any point in time, they would be ready to pray. But on the seventh day, you're supposed to work just as hard, but you change your emphasis to where you're laboring in the supernatural without forgetting the natural.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean to sit on a couch and, eat popcorn watching the game.
Yeah.
It means to work just as hard, but you change the emphasis from the supernatural being the lesser to the major.
Yeah.
Okay? But at the time of the crucifixion, the pattern in the Old Testament flips 180 degrees. And today we have one day we call Sunday that we gather, say, in the church to be built up, to learn the things, to be strengthened, to then go out and work 6 days. So that pattern flips over 180 degrees. And so we
Right.
get energized on day one to go out and work for 6.
Right.
But Shabbat is misunderstood in terms of that word rest, because it doesn't mean to stop laboring. It doesn't mean to sit on, as we would say, yiddish, tos.
Yeah.
And
I think I can figure out what that is.
yeah. But people misunderstand that.
Yeah.
But it's really what it refers to.
So let's go to a different topic, if you will. We were talking earlier about the young Earth, young creation versus billions and billions of years, and so one of our listeners was asking a question about the kinds and the species and how all of that came about, and how is that related to, or how can even that there debunk the evolutionist idea of over a long period of time all these things happened. How do you see all of that?
Well, first of all, again, there's actually 2 kinds of evolutionary basic thought. Now,
Okay.
I mentioned it's atheism and it supports it, but no two agreed on exactly how it occurred, and the first guy would change his mind if you gave him time, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So there's the Darwinian microevolutionary view, a very slow and gradual change. Theoretically, the concepts of survival of the fittest and natural selection, which are not true and prove creation, but they want to deceive you into believing that this is a part of evolution. But it's the slow, gradual amoeba to man. That little tiny changes over a long period of time add up to big changes. And that's called microevolution.
Okay.
So there's the slow, gradual, that's most of them. But I want to compliment that there are some evolutionists that are honest. There's still a deception involved, but they're honest in the sense that there are evolutionists who admit that's not what we see.
Okay.
Now, Darwin knew that. Darwin knew that there were gaps. He said, well, there's this in the record and that in the record. And, we'd been finding dinosaurs for about 50 years by the time Darwin came along and recognizable and naming them. Sir Richard Owen did a lot of that work. And so he knew that there were these fossils, and he actually had a pretty good understanding of marine shells. But his idea was slow and gradual, and that nature, again, quote, selects and the survival of the fittest, and he applied all that. Now, first of all, they're not true. Nature doesn't select anything. To select, you have to have intelligence, and nature doesn't have intelligence. And it is not always survival of the fittest. The truth of the matter is it's survival of the luckiest.
Yeah.
But that was his concept.
Yeah.
And he knew that there were gaps. He knew that. By faith, he believed that people would fill in the gaps later and fill in the slow, gradual, transitional forms.
Yeah.
But starting pretty much around the 60s and 70s, there were evolutionists who said, it doesn't matter how much we dig up, we don't find any transitional forms.
Right.
Every time we find a creature, it's whole, complete. It's not half this, half that. Yeah. It's not mushy as to what it is. Did you ever think about this? The ability to name creatures specifically is a proof of creation and refutes evolution. Because if, in fact, evolution were true in the microevolutionary view, you would never be able to name anything.
Right.
It's just a mush.
All be in transition. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just all in transition. Right. You couldn't say this is a dog, a horse, a cow.
Yeah.
And so the ability to do that disproves evolution right there.
And so instead of the gaps being filled,
we now know gaps more than Darwin did.
More gaps, yeah.
Oh, yeah. The more we dig up, the more gaps. We find more creatures, but they're always unique, distinct, whole, complete. There are no transitional forms.
Yeah.
Even Gould said that was the trade secret of the paleontologists, that there are no transitional forms in the fossil record. It's a fairy tale for adults.
So let me. I asked you this the other day off the record, but so if Darwin was alive today and he saw what you see now, what you have learned, do you think he'd believe in his own theory anymore?
Well, it's hard to say, and I don't like to answer hypothetical questions because it didn't happen. That's not what happened. I can say that Darwin's father, Robert, was a medical doctor and an evolutionist. And Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, was a medical doctor. And Erasmus actually believed in evolution, wrote a lot about it. Darwin actually got a lot of his evolutionary thinking from his grandfather, mostly, and his father, partly. So he grew up in an evolutionary believing home. So it's a little hard to say. But I point out the vast amount of things that Darwin did not know. And therefore, if he did know them, it would certainly cause him to come up tight on it and maybe not accept evolution.
Yeah.
I don't know. But he knew nothing about genetics. Charles Darwin's concept of a living cell was a Ziploc bag with Jell-O. He didn't know anything about the fact that every living cell is as complex as an entire body. Your body has trillions of cells individually that add up to you, but every cell has a pulmonary system, an alimentary canal. It has a nervous system, a brain, basically. It has moving parts.
Yeah.
It has all of the structure and complexity of an entire body.
Yeah. My son just had to make a little extra credit cell project, for his class. So he had all these parts inside this little box,
Well,
with all the labels
and
on there.
the organelles and so forth, the mitochondria, all of these structures. He knew nothing about that. He knew nothing about genetics. Now, Gregor Mendel was developing the laws of genetics at the same time that Darwin was alive, but Darwin never knew about Mendel, and Mendel's works were not published until he was dead, so it was posthumous recognition. But Darwin didn't know anything about that. So I think if he knew the complexity of genetics, it would certainly cause him to come up short. Because if you understand genetics, you know it couldn't possibly have evolved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when we take a look at this evolution concept that's based in Darwinism, it's the slow, gradual kind. Although Darwin was actually a Lamarckian evolutionist. Now, Lamarck was a Frenchman who published before Darwin and believed in the inheritance of acquired traits.
Okay.
Now, I look at my brother over here, kind of a mini Arnold Schwarzenegger. and so Lamarck believed that you build up big muscles, or let's say Arnold Schwarzenegger, everybody pretty much familiar with him.
Yeah. Right.
That because Arnold had all these big muscles, if he had a son, his son would have the same big muscles.
Yeah, I know.
Exactly. But you know as well as I do, unless the son pumped the same amount of iron and everything else, he wouldn't get those muscles, right?
Right.
And the concept of Lamarckianism was destroyed before Darwin even came along. And it was a cruel experiment in one sense of the word. But what they did was, rats have tails. And so they cut off the tails of the rats, and they had babies. But the baby rats still had tails. So they cut off the tails of the baby rats. But when they grew up and had kids, their babies still had tails. And so finally, after many generations, they gave up and said the inheritance of acquired traits was not true. But Darwin actually did believe it was. He didn't understand genetics. See, that was his way of thinking about what we think of as genetics, but totally flawed.
So, so speaking on genetics, then, just to go back to this kinds and species, genetically, it's impossible, right, for
Absolutely
one
impossible.
kind to become another kind. Is that right?
The laws of genetics prevent it from happening.
So these kinds did not evolve out of one, combination of chemicals and substance and then became other kinds. It's impossible, right?
It's impossible.
Okay.
And to complete the thought, there are honest evolutionists who know that slow and gradual is not what we see.
Right.
They say, Stephen Jay Gould, who was a premier evolutionist, teacher of paleontology and science history. He wrote great articles on science history, although from an evolutionary standpoint. But he was a great science historian. But in his paleontology studies, he came to realize that there was no slow and gradual. You cannot find a transitional form of the fossil record. And he had a graduate student working under him getting his PhD, Niles Eldridge, who later got his PhD and moved to New York. But they're working at Harvard, and they agree there's no transitional forms of fossil record. But we are evolutionists. And in fact, Gould was a Marxist by philosophy. And so he was an adamant atheist.
Okay.
But he did believe evolution to be true, period. And yet he could see there were no transitional forms in the fossil record. So they came up with a concept of what's called punctuated equilibria, or equilibrium. And that idea was that evolution is absolutely true, but that what had happened in the past was not the slow, gradual process.
Okay.
That what had happened was, over millions and millions of years, there had been what's called stasis or equilibrium, no change. Okay? So a creature was living and did not change for millions at least millions of years. And then suddenly this was punctuated. Okay?
Okay.
Not by one generation, but by 3 or 4. That there was a rapid burst of evolution over a period of just 3 or 4 generations. And then this was followed by equilibrium or stasis again with no change for millions of years. So what he was saying was that the transition, lasting only 2, 3, 4 generations, occurred so fast
that you can't find any evidence.
That the transitions were not caught in the fossil record.
That's just...
So I want you to think about this. Darwin said evolution was so slow that you couldn't see it. Gould and Eldridge come along and say it occurs too fast to see.
Yeah.
Now, what is the only conclusion you can come to? You just can't see it.
No, nobody can see it. You're just making up stories now.
They're just fairy tales for adults.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, when it comes to then how that applies to genetics and species and kinds and so forth, in the Bible, God uses the word kinds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have a very clever system of classification. You may know that it was started actually by a Christian creation-believing scientist in Sweden, whose name was Latinized to Linnaeus Carolinus, but he is the one who came up with a system of kingdoms, plant and animal kingdom, and then going to phylums, classes, orders, and then you get down to family, genus. Below that, you get to what is sometimes called species, and then there's varieties, or the science word is race, but not in a bad sense, but it really means variety.
Uh-huh.
And we've got this very clever system. And again, this proves creation is true because you could pigeonhole things. Really. And it's a really good system, but it's a human system. That's not the way God classifies creatures. If you go to the 5th day of creation in Genesis 1, it says that God created, for instance, the typical English translation is flying or feathered birds. But the Hebrew word that's used there does not mean just birds, because God's classification system is different than ours.
Mm-hmm.
It means any animal, not insect, but any animal that flies. So it does include feathered birds, and that's where it's most often translated that way. But it also means mammals and reptiles that fly. So it includes bats, those are mammals,
Mm-hmm.
and the flying reptiles, which includes pterosaurs, pterodons, and so on.
That's right.
And so God's classification, he lumps things together in a much broader way than we do.
I've studied that, in Hebrew. Yeah, okay. You have the flying things, and then you have the creepy crawling things.
Right.
That's how he divides them.
He classifies them in a very different way than we do.
Yeah.
So our method is really great for classification and pigeonholing, but his method is quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to remember that when you're reading those scriptures. And it wasn't just flying birds. It was all flying animals.
Yeah.
Secondly, of course, God created everything perfect as it was in the beginning. So he created one man, one woman, perfect as human beings. And one pair of dogs, but they're dog-like kind. They're canine-like kind. So God did not create dachshunds and German shepherds. He created one pair of dog-like creatures.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, today we know, and the experiments have proven it, that yes, wolves, dogs, coyotes, and foxes are all dogs. There was a long time when people didn't know whether foxes were dogs or just dog-like in structure. Just like primates are similar in structure to us, and they weren't. But we have proven now. Actually, it was Russian scientists who proved it in 2012. So, first of all, when God says kind, now we think really that's equivalent to the family in the system of taxonomy that we use. So that's above genus, it's above species, it's family. So while we have, say, thousands of genus in mammals, we only have hundreds of families. And so God made everything perfect for what it was, with perfect genetic information for what it was, whether it was an amoeba, a dog, a cow, bovine-like creature. And they had perfect genetic information for that kind. And think about Adam and Eve for the human kind. And they had all the genetic information that would then produce all the variety that we see today. You know, you were either a descendant of Adam and Eve or you're not human, period.
Got it.
You're a descendant of Noah, his 3 sons, their 3 wives, or you're not human.
Mm-hmm.
And so, first of all humans come from that one root, regardless of size, color, whatever, doesn't matter. But God put in there enough variation in the genetic information that then allows for the varieties that we see today.
Yeah.
Now, people talk about, and particularly skin color, it's inappropriate, but they do. Adam and Eve were not white, but they weren't black either. They were probably medium brown or olive skin. But in their bodies, they had the variation that in one generation, their sons, we think of Cain and Abel and Seth and as descendants, although in chapter 5, Adam and Eve had many other sons and daughters. But in the first generation, their first broods, they could have had children of 4 different colors. So variation was built in by God instantaneously. By recombining the information that was in Adam and Eve's body.
So it's not the climate or the location.
Climate has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Nothing.
I mean, I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, see, there's an utterly false, terrible heresy that people say that dark-skinned people come from Ham.
Oh, okay.
Because Hamitic tribes do come from Africa, but the Hamitic tribes are Africa, Asia, North and South America. Those are all Hamitic.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Japheth, that's India through Iran or Persia, Turkey, all the way to Norway. Okay. That's the Japhetic tribes. And the Semitic tribes are the Middle East. That's the Jews and Arabs. No, I didn't say Muslims. No, this is not religious.
Right.
But the ethnicity of Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. I have an entire teaching on this, both biblical and scientific, as to how this all happens. But God put the genetic information in there. After all, God does love diversity. Why would he want to make people that all look alike and he's got to look at all of them? So that no 2 people on earth have exactly the same genetic information. We are all individual creations.
And we're all brothers and sisters of God the Father, right? Mm-hmm. I mean,
we
sons and daughters of God the Father.
We are all related.
Wow.
Okay, period. Now, where did the different variations that we see today come from? Well, this again has to do with the Ark of Noah, the flood of Noah, and God's instructions. Mm-hmm. Now, before the flood, the human population, the dog population or canine population, and the bovine and so forth, there was variety, but not a lot of variation. But there is going to be. It's a relatively homogeneous population because they're all interbreeding, okay, across the entire spectrum. Humans with humans. And so you have a fairly homogeneous population, and that's true of the animals and plants and so on. But what happens at the time of the flood? Now, Noah didn't select the animals, God did. He gave the architectural drawings to Noah for 20 years, and then Noah was building it for 100.
Yeah.
But he's busy building, and he wouldn't know. Noah wouldn't have the knowledge to know, but God would. So it says that God sent the animals, and he sent 1 pair of the unclean and 3.5 pairs of the clean. 4 males, 3 females. The 4th male is sacrificed in the burnt offering after the flood by Noah for surviving the flood, and that leaves 3 pairs of clean. So 1 pair of the unclean, 3 pairs of the clean. But there was a qualification that most people don't remember in the Bible when they read it. In order to be on the ark, you had to live on dry land, which is pretty obvious, but you also had to breathe air through nostrils. Mm-hmm. That was the qualifier. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing aquatic. There's no aquariums in the ark. Mm-hmm. And there are animals that are questionable because we don't have a list specific.
Right.
But for instance, no insects, because insects don't breathe air through nostrils. They breathe through little holes inside their body called spiracles. But they don't have nostrils, right? Yep. Now, there had to be some insects in the ark because the door was open.
Yeah.
I also cannot believe that a pair of camels could get on the ark without a pair of fleas.
Yeah.
Oh, they're a flea hotel. But anyway, so there were some accidental ones. But aren't you kind of glad he didn't send termites?
Yeah.
So
That might be a problem.
yeah. So how did the insects survive? They survived on the billions of trees floating on the flood. Yeah, after all, you don't have to have a lot survive to repopulate. But there's enough that survive on the floating logs. And then there's some cases that it's hard to say. So there were no whales, unlike Star Trek. Guess you don't know that one.
No.
But there's nothing totally aquatic in the ark for obvious reasons. But there are some animals that we really cannot be absolutely certain about, such as penguins. Penguins live on dry land. They breathe air through nostrils, but they hunt in the water. And so being in the ark might be a little tough, but they could again survive on the floating logs. They could get out to rest and hunt in the water. Or seals, they might fall in the same sense, hunt in the water, but rest on the logs. So there's some that we can't be absolutely positive about because it doesn't say.
Yeah.
But the basics was live on dry land, breathe air through nostrils. So, number one, basically no insects, at least scent. No amphibians. Amphibians like to be wet. Being in the ark would be a problem. And again, enough could survive on the floating debris of the logs to survive, enough to repopulate. So what you're looking at is most, if not all birds, again, the penguins, maybe a little iffy, but basically birds, the dry land reptiles, the dry land mammals, and 8 people. That's all there is.
Yeah.
And that includes dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were on the ark.
Really?
Well, they're unclean. Reptiles are defined as unclean in the Bible, period. And so you have, but God says kinds. Now, I have a video and so forth on what was and what was not in the ark and how many there were and so forth. Now, the ark was more than large enough to do the job that God designed it to do. If we look at the genus level, the maximum number that would have to be on the ark to repopulate the earth is 17,500. But if it's at the family level, at the kind level, it would only take 1,800.
Oh.
And the ark was vastly big enough for that. It's not an issue at all. The only reason it was that big was survivability. And so the ark had plenty of room for the animals, and 8 people could care for them for a year. It's not an issue. It's not a big deal when you start breaking it down.
Yeah.
But people will go up to Christians and say, well, you cannot possibly believe the story of the ark and Noah and the animals. And they'll say, well, you can't possibly believe that there was one pair of dachshunds and one pair of German shepherds and one pair of English sheepdogs and one pair of poodles on the ark. And I agree with them completely. First of all, nature would never produce a poodle in the first place. But
easy now. Come on.
Well, they were manufactured by the Egyptians 2,000 years ago as a hunting dog for ducks. But the fact of the matter is that poodles and German shepherds and dachshunds, that's artificial selection using human intelligence.
Right.
That's not natural. That's artificial selection. That's a very important point. And so what happens? God sent one pair of canine-like creatures that had all the genetic information for all the various canine creatures we see today. And like I said, that goes from wolves to foxes. One pair of horse-like creatures. And that includes everything from mules to zebras. Zebras are horses with stripes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have done the breeding experiments to prove that they all interbreed. Every kind of horse-like creature can interbreed if you do it in reasonable increments of size. And so that, as a matter of fact, in Africa, when you hike up Mount Kilimanjaro, that's a 19,000-foot high volcano. You can only drive so far. Mm-hmm. The pack animals that they use in Africa to go on up the mountain are half horse and half zebra.
Okay.
They're as tough as a zebra and as smart as a horse.
Wow.
I have pictures of herds of zebroids where you see these horses with more or less stripes on them. And if you take a zebra and a horse and mate them, take the offspring, mate it with a horse, offspring with a horse, offspring with a horse, in 4 generations, the stripes disappear.
Oh, okay. Wow.
We've done this.
Yeah.
Again, you would only need 1 pair of feline type creatures to get all the cats in the world. And again, we have done the experiments. We've done the crossbreeding. You can go from a house cat to a lion and tiger and back again.
Okay.
If you do it in reasonable increments.
Yeah.
And we do it all the time.
Yeah. So you mentioned dinosaurs. We haven't had a chance to talk about that
They were
yet.
just itching to bring that.
Oh, yeah.
The dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Now, dinosaurs, people, again, been taught in evolution, as I was, that they became extinct 65 million supposed years ago, came into existence 225 million supposed years ago. They teach that no human ever saw a dinosaur, vice versa. But when we look at the Bible, now God made the flying reptiles and the aquatic reptiles, the marine reptiles, on day 5.
Mm-hmm.
That would include creatures like the great marine reptiles, plesiosaurs, elasmosaurs, chronosaurs, and so forth, what people think of as contemporary with dinosaurs. So the pterodons and pterodactyls, Rhamphorhynchus and the like, and the great marine reptiles, which in the Bible, Leviathan, you think of them as living at the same time as the dinosaurs. They're not dinosaurs, but they are reptiles.
Okay.
And so God made the reptiles that people think are of a dinosaur period that fly and swim on day 5. But God made the dinosaurs on day 6. Now, not all reptiles are dinosaurs, but all dinosaurs are reptiles.
Okay.
There's a distinct structural difference between them. And so, but God specifically says he made the beasts of the field or the beasts of the earth, depends on your translation, which is a direct reference to terrestrial dinosaurs on day 6, the same day he made Adam and Eve, only they came along later. And so dinosaurs were created on day 6 with Adam and Eve, as well as other dry land reptiles. And it wasn't a problem. Never get your education from Hollywood.
Wow.
Don't get your education from Jurassic Park. Even the evolutionists agree the movies are not right.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, don't tell anybody. But Jurassic Park number 4 was so bad that even Major League Evolution says you shouldn't go see it. It was so ridiculous. And I think they're up to 102 now, right? Jurassic Park.
No.
But they are not consistent with the theories of evolution that they were made to support. And I can assure you, Lord Attenborough made them in order to support evolution. But they're not even consistent with the evolutionary theories. We could get into that later if you want to. But people and dinosaurs lived together because dinosaurs didn't eat each other initially, and they didn't eat people. If you take a look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 and 30, God made everything vegetarian to start with.
Yeah.
So remember, sharp claws and sharp teeth do not indicate what a creature eats. Evolutionists have deceived everybody into believing sharp teeth and sharp claws is a carnivore. And that flat teeth are a vegetarian. It's not true. It is an absolute lie and deception. And sitting here today, 23 years ago, evolutionists at the highest level reclassified T-Rexes, Velociraptors, Oviraptors as vegetarians.
Really?
Wow.
Now, when has the public been told that?
Yeah, I had someone that wanted me to ask that question. If God made this T-Rex such a vicious animal, why would God do that? And you're saying,
but evolutionists changed their minds at the highest level. Now, here's the problem. Junior high school science teachers, senior high school science teachers, college level teachers, first often have an agenda where they want to teach an evolutionary worldview, and therefore they are not going to mention this. They censure science. They don't let you know what is contradictory to evolution. And so they intentionally censor it. But also, in many cases, they don't even know what's going on at the upper levels of evolution because they don't stay current.
Yeah, they don't keep up with it all.
Think about it. When you go to a pedagogical university to learn how to teach, say public schools, the primary emphasis is on how to teach. And you also learn material in the fields like science or math or whatever you're going to do. But often they don't stay up in the modern literature.
Right.
And what they end up doing is repeating the same thing for 20, 30, 40 years. And they don't stay current, and they don't even know that these creatures were reclassified as vegetarians. But it is so easy for people, once you introduce them to the information. First of all, think about a T-Rex, and you've all seen T-Rexes, okay? Movies. You've seen them in the museum skeletons and pictures and so on. They've got big, sharp teeth. I agree. The largest T-Rex tooth ever found was 10.5 inches long, and I span 10.5 inches. They're long, they're pointed, they look very, very menacing.
Okay.
But they only have a 4-inch root, which means it's shallow rooted. You look at the pictures and realize the teeth aren't touching each other like ours. Now, our teeth reinforce each other because they're next to each other. But T-Rex teeth are individuals, right?
Yep.
And they're shallow rooted. Have you ever seen one up front and personal? I mean, really looked at one up close?
No.
T-Rex teeth have serrations like a bread knife on the front and back edge. Oh, yeah, really. Now, you don't need that to eat meat. You need that to eat thick, fibrous vegetable material. And think of a palm frond or a banana leaf. Okay?
Yeah.
In addition, think about if it were true that T-Rex was a big killer and it's killing another dinosaur, because that's another big thing that, weighs a couple of tons, whatever, and it were to bite into it, what would happen to the teeth?
They would get stuck.
Not stuck.
Oh, they
They'd
just
break.
come out. Yeah.
They just break.
Yeah.
But we don't find them that way. And T-Rexes don't replace their teeth like sharks do.
Mm-hmm.
And so the teeth would simply snap and break. But that's not the way. Now, we find broken teeth, but it's because in the earth they've been broken, but not because they were biting into something.
Yeah.
And then you've got those little short arms.
Yeah.
Did you ever notice that? You've got sharp claws, true, but the arms are so short they can't feed themselves with those things.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
And they're too slow to catch anything fast. And then, finally, we have found coprolite. Do you know what coprolite is?
No.
I'll try to be polite. It's fossil dung.
Okay.
So we have found the fossil dung of T-Rexes and velociraptors and so forth, and guess what? It's plant material. We have found a few broken up small bones, but that probably came from one of two reasons. One, it might have just been accidental. Secondly, think about it. Death didn't exist before Adam's sin.
Right.
And so, curiosity killed the cat, but animals have a certain degree of curiosity, all of them. And so here's this T-Rex lumbering along, who is a vegetarian, but he sees this small other species of dinosaur, whatever it is, that has died. And out of animal curiosity, goes over and muzzles it and says, "Come on, wake up, bud, let's play," right?
Okay.
But he doesn't wake up and he won't play. Well, you might say, okay, well, just try it out. Chomp. It's that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, we do know that they did start fighting and so forth just before the flood. I mean, we've got teeth marks and bones and so forth. But initially, they were vegetarians, period. And so they didn't eat people. They didn't initially eat each other. You could have had a pet T-Rex before the flood, until it got too big to keep in the house.
Yeah. So
you don't keep a 30-foot-long reptile in the house, let me tell you.
Yeah.
But they did live together, and they are mentioned in the Bible. There are 14 references to dinosaurs or their relatives in the Old Testament, 12 of them after the flood.
Really?
So they had to be on the ark. And they are unclean. So there was one pair of each dinosaur kind, not species, family, kind. And that means that there's only well, there's only about 50 kinds of dinosaurs. And so there was 100, 110 or so dinosaurs total on the ark. And people say, well, how could that be? Well, first of all, think with me. If you're God and you want to repopulate the earth after the flood, are you going to send the oldest, biggest animals maybe past the age of reproduction? Or are you going to send the juveniles of the age of puberty?
Right.
Well, you're going to send the age of puberty ones, right? Now, we know from studies of dinosaur skeletons that dinosaurs at puberty and after had a really rapid growth rate. Now, reptiles never stop growing. You know that. The longer the snake, the older the snake.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And down in Florida, we have reptiles, lots of reptiles, And so the longer the alligator, crocodile, the snake, the older, right? So first of all, they never stop growing. But at puberty, they have this burst of additional growth into adulthood. Now, before the flood, humans lived, men, 900 years plus. The average is 912. If you take out Enoch, who was taken alive to heaven, or wherever God took him, and you got one guy who died young at 770.
Yeah.
But if you take those two out, the average 912. Now in Florida, we have over 1 million alligators. Now, the average life expectancy of an alligator in Florida at this time, where they're not hunted. Now, we do have a hunting season on them, but where they're not hunted, the average life expectancy is 50 years.
Oh, wow.
And men are 75. So that means that alligators in Florida today live 2/3 as long as people, right? 50, 75. So if men were living 900 years, how old was the alligator?
600.
600.
That's
and they
big,
never,
that's a big alligator.
they never stopped growing. And I have pictures of alligator fossils up to 50 foot long.
Wow.
Now, who's to say they aren't the same species we have today, but allowed to grow for a longer period of time? That's totally rational. But they are egg layers. All dinosaurs come from eggs. And so God is not going to send a fully mature adult. He's going to send a juvenile at the age of puberty. And so they're much smaller on the ark than you would think.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a male giraffe tops out at about 17 and a half feet, but they reproduce when they're only 12, 13,
Okay.
And so again, they wouldn't be as big on the ark as you think, because people are thinking about mature adults. No, these are juveniles.
Yeah.
And so there's plenty of room on the ark for that. Now, there were dinosaurs, and they are mentioned. And the first reference is in Job. Now, the flood's about 2,350 years before Christ, BC. Job is living at 2000 BC, 350 years after the flood.
Okay.
In Job chapter 40, verse 15, behold, God says, behold now Behemoth. Now, the word is not translated in the English translations. That's just English characters for a Hebrew word, Behemoth.
Mm-hmm.
But if you translated it into English, it means beast of beasts. Beast of beasts. So first of all, does that sound big?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 15, he eats grass like an ox. He's a vegetarian.
Mm-hmm.
Behold now, pay special attention to this creature called the Behemoth, the beast of beasts. And says, I made with you. Now that's subtle, but dinosaurs were made on the same day as people.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay, so behold this beast of beasts, who's a vegetarian, that I made with you.
Okay.
Verse 16, tremendous power and strength. This is a big, powerful animal. Verse 17, a tail the size of a cedar tree, not a twig. And the last verse there, in verse 18, describing Behemoth, is very scientific, and people don't realize it. It sounds poetic, particularly if you're King James and King James based, the Shakespearean language, because he says he has bones that are like tubes of bronze and bars of iron. And that sounds poetic,
Yeah.
but that is a scientific statement. Mammals and people, we have solid bones.
Mm-hmm.
This cannot be what some people say. It cannot be a hippopotamus, a rhinoceros, an elephant, a mastodon, a mammoth. It cannot be. First of all, they don't have big tails. They got tiny little tails. But mammals have solid bones. Reptiles and birds have hollow bones. Their bones are tubes.
Yeah.
And so God is telling you this is a reptile.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's interesting.
So it's a scientific statement. People just gloss right
Yeah,
over.
yeah. Wow.
and before the flood, how did T-Rexes and velociraptors and so forth eat? They were vegetarians. Again, think about the distance apart the teeth are in a T-Rex, say, or other creatures. How did they eat? They walked, well, before the flood, there were vast forests, particularly of lycopod trees that are extinct today, but they had big leaves. And there were palm fronds and banana leaves and so forth. So a T-Rex just walks over to something that has these big leaves, clomps down on it, and goes sideways, and simply strips the pulp off the skeleton of the leaf. And that's how they were eating.
Okay. Wow.
Now, after the flood, Behemoth is the first one described, and that's 350 years after the flood. But in Job chapter 41, you have Leviathan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, God has got to love Leviathans. He mentions them 5 times. But the description in Job 41 is clearly a large marine reptile. But you have many others. Now, in Isaiah, he talks about Leviathan, and think about it. I mean, Job's 2000 BC, but Isaiah is 700.
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah lives 700 to 750 BC. He's a contemporary of Hezekiah.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that there are leviathans in the oceans, these great marine reptiles. And twice he talks about flying dragons, flying reptiles. The King James uses dragons. And because of my mission work when I was in Russia, the Russians say flying dragons. And in Portuguese, some translations use flying dragons. So they're talking about a reptile.
Yeah. Wow.
If we go to Psalm 91:13, if you go to Psalm 91:13,
Sure.
It depends on your translation, but some translations actually do translate it dragon. That's
Okay.
Psalm 91, verse 13.
All right, let me read it. All right, it says, "You will tread upon the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent."
But serpent is another word for reptile.
Okay.
So, lizard, reptile, serpent, those are interchangeable terms. But in some translations, it's translated dragon.
Okay.
Just a footnote there.
Yeah.
But it does talk about serpents. It does talk about reptiles there.
Yeah.
There are some more obscure places. Sometimes it's kind of hard, particularly because of the translations and so forth. But in Micah and other places, there are references to either dinosaurs, dragons, because that was the word we called dinosaurs before 1841. Before 1841, the word dinosaur doesn't exist. And the most common word was dragon.
Okay.
And there were a few others too, but dragon was the big one. But the word dinosaur was not invented until 1841. And so we have in the Bible record of people and dinosaurs or their relatives living together until the close of the Old Testament.
Wow.
But we have reliable human history of people and dinosaurs living together after the close of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is completed or closed about 400 BC.
Okay.
At that time, there's the first truly great secular historian. And he comes along. His name is Herodotus. He is a Greek, and he believes in evolution because the Greek world believed in evolution. The world of Alexander the Great, the Hellenistic world, believed in evolution. But he also writes in his histories about flying reptiles. When we go to the time of Alexander the Great, history records that as his troops were invading northwestern India, that was the maximum extent of his conquering, that they saw dragons, dinosaurs, along the way. Now, that's 2,300 years ago. 2,000 years ago, Flavius Josephus talks about flying reptiles. Now, he's a Jew, apostate, but at the same time, we have a Roman naturalist, Pliny the Elder, who talks about dinosaurs, dragons, living in India. Now, he never went to India. He never saw that firsthand. It was secondary information, but he writes about it at the same time that, Josephus is writing. But only a couple hundred years later, we have another Roman naturalist named Flavius Philostratus, who went to India and said India was full of dragons, that every ridge and every swamp had them, and that the ones in the swamp were sluggish and had no crest on their head. Now, why would he include they had no crest on their head unless he knew there were others that did? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Then we have Marco Polo. Now, in the 1270s, Marco Polo walks to China, and he enters western China in 1273. And he correctly describes a large two-legged dinosaur. In 1611, not the Bible of 1611, but in China, we have the official court records of the Emperor of China having to hire a royal dragon caregiver. I'm just giving you some samples. I mean, St. George and the Dragon is a real story. It's not a myth. There really was a St. George, and he really killed a dragon in the early 300s. We have the epic poetry, Beowulf and others, that clearly, if you read the language, knowing that it's Old English, but when you read it, clearly describe dinosaurs or flying reptiles. We have the writings of the Chronicles of Canterbury Cathedral in 1446, where they saw two dragons fighting each other for an hour, describing them as fire-breathing, by the way. In 1496, the Bishop Bell, the bishop of the cathedral at Carlisle. Now, the Carlisle Cathedral is one of the most northern cathedrals in England. It's right up against the Scottish border. I've been there. And he died in 1496, buried in the floor of the cathedral, which was the tradition to do, of course. And on top of his tomb are two dinosaurs with their necks intertwined. But what's really interesting, although that's interesting enough, is that they're two different species. And one has 4 spikes on its tail, the other doesn't. We can actually identify the species of dinosaur this is representing. It's identifiable. The other one's our best guess. That's 1496. and we can keep going. The last known sighting that's documented reliably by humans comes from an evolutionary source where they say they saw a live dinosaur, an armored dinosaur, in Bolivia in 1883.
Wow.
Now, when an evolutionist tells you they saw a live dinosaur in 1883, I think you ought to pay attention. But we also have other things. We've got artifacts and art from all over the world. We have figures of dinosaurs from Chinese tombs. In Mexico, we found, right after World War II, we found 33,000 fired clay figurines, many of them showing dinosaurs, and in some cases with people. All over the world, we find this art and these artifacts where people have made figurines or they've painted or something like that of dinosaurs. So they had to see them. Out in the southwest of the United States, out in Arizona, New Mexico, that area, we find pictographs of dinosaurs. Now, I'm a North American Indian. I have dual citizenship. I'm an official member of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma and a citizen of the United States. Now, the Indians of North America, Central America, South America were very different when it comes to technology, sophistication, and so forth. And I can say that because I are one, right? So I'm not throwing anybody under the bus here. Think about Central and South America. They did sculpture. They built massive stone structures that would rival the Egyptians, pyramids that would rival the Egyptians or those in China. They had art, they had language, they were great mathematicians, they were very good astronomers, they had sports, and I mean, in big cities and so on. But in North America, that's not true. I think I know why, but in North America, that's not true. In North America, and I'll say that, I think we were placekeepers. So when the people migrated from the Ark to North America and down to South America and so forth, the sophisticated ones that could do all of these things, all this technology, astronomy and math and buildings and so forth, went to Central and South America. But us North Americans, I think we were here for the purpose of just keeping the land until Christianity would come. Okay?
Wow.
So, opinion.
Yeah.
But I also want you to think about it. But the North American Indians, regardless of anything, were not sophisticated. They didn't build big buildings, and they didn't do art, and they really didn't have much math, and so. But when they did art, they only did two kinds. Yeah, I mean, just check me out. Look at any museum of North American Indian arts. They did geometrics, lots of geometrics, on potteries and baskets and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that. And decorations that were geometric and so forth, whether they were in color or not. And what they saw. Now, there's a pictograph of a large two-legged dinosaur in the Havasupai Indian Reservation near the Grand Canyon. But we have large four-footed dinosaurs in pictographs throughout much of Utah in that area. In Canada, on the north shore of Lake Superior. Now, we're not that far away.
Mm-hmm.
But on the north shore of Lake Superior, Canadian North American Indians actually have a pictograph of an ankylosaur. That's an armored dinosaur.
Mm.
So it doesn't matter what continent you go to, whether it's figurines or art or whatever, you see that people and dinosaurs really did live together, and that evolutionists are lying to you.
Okay, so Dr. McMurtry, we heard that you have some material out on a very interesting topic. So we want to just take a couple minutes and end with this. We want to go way out there and talk about aliens.
Okay.
So what do you have to say about aliens, and what's interesting about that you'd like to share?
Well, that is interesting. I actually have an article on my website if people want to read it. But the evolutionists want you to believe that this is not special, that Earth is not special, that we are not special, that life evolves throughout the universe, and they'll try to give you all kinds of deceptive ways into believing that. But first of all, let's get scientific. In science, until you find it, it doesn't. I know that you kind of massage that, but until you find it, it doesn't exist.
Right.
Now, in science, we've never found aliens. I mean, you can look at all the science fiction you want, but we've never found aliens or anything like that. And we have found over 5,000 exoplanets. So, not in our solar system, but in the solar systems within approximately 400 light years of here.
What does that mean, exoplanet?
Well, meaning outside of our solar system.
Okay.
But these are stars that have one or more planets that are orbiting the star, and we have found over 5,000 of them just in our little corner of the galaxy.
Okay.
And when I say our little corner, our galaxy is 100 to 125,000 light years across, and it's just one galaxy. And there are over 100 billion galaxies.
Yeah, my brain can't comprehend that.
We have a big God. Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
But just in the corner where our technology allows us to find them. Now, we've never actually seen them. They're inferred. But it's good data.
Okay.
Like the shadow passing the sun periodically, it's a planet that's orbiting. Or you see a star being pulled one way or the other by the gravity of a planet that's orbiting. So we infer them, but they're definitely there.
Okay.
It's not an argument.
Okay.
But none of them can support life. None of them. They're too hot. They're too cold. They're too small. They're too big or whatever. But we have found these planets.
Mhm.
Now, the evolutionists want you to believe that we are not special, that we're just part of the process of random chance, and that life evolved here, but it evolved in other galaxies, and etc. But it's totally deceptive. We've never found them. But let's take a look at what the Bible says.
Okay.
Now, in Psalm 115, God says this is the only place where people exist. This is the only place where there's anything that's made in the image of God that can experience sin and salvation. That's Psalm 115. In the New Testament, it says that Jesus Christ came here and died once for all. Now, God is the only one in the universe that can say all and mean it.
Right.
We use the word generically. I could walk into a room with 100 people that say here at the church, I could say, well, all of us in here are Christians. Well, no, not necessarily. One might not be. So I was using it generically.
Mm-hmm.
But God would not say all unless it were. If it was 99 but not 100, he would say, no, all but one.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Whatever. And so that's very important. Now, let's be realistic, too. God also tells us he decorates the universe for his own good pleasure. That's why no two planets are exactly the same. That's why no people are exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do you know where the word universe comes from?
No idea.
Okay. Well, uni means one,
Mm-hmm.
right? But uni means one, and the verse comes from diversity. So the universe is a whole, complete thing, one thing with diversity. That's the universe.
Mm.
Well, if God says, I decorate the universe for my own good pleasure, then he can put planets anywhere he wants to, and they're all different, just as people are all different. And there's nothing in the Bible that says or precludes there being plants or animals on another planet somewhere. I mean, that is not precluded. No statement says there are not. But God says there are not anything else anywhere in the universe like us. That we are unique, made in the image of God, can experience sin and salvation, that Christ came here and died once for all. Now, if there were people someplace else that could sin and be saved, then to fulfill God's righteousness, Jesus would have to go there and reveal himself to them and die for them too, right?
Mm-hmm.
But God says, no, this is the only place it happened. It only happened once. Now, when it comes to aliens, you've heard plenty of stories about aliens and people seeing aliens and UFOs and all that kind of jazz. But what is it that they're seeing? Well, you know as well as I do that 99% of all alien UFO scenes are alcohol, peyote, yeah, something of that nature. But 1% of them really did see something, So the issue is, what did they see? Now, remember that God's angels can come to earth in the form, assuming the form of human men, in order to communicate and not be monstrous, that they look like us, and so we'll talk with them, and we're not fearful. Well, they can take the form of human men. I would point out they never take the form of human women, and angels are not gendered to begin with. They don't have gender. They're angels.
Mm-hmm.
So they can take the form of human men in order to communicate with us. And we have various references in the Old Testament to that, right? Well, if God's unfallen angels can take the form of human men, then demonic fallen angels can also transform into something visible. And in Satan's plan, he cannot create, but he can counterfeit. He cannot create, but he can manipulate. And Satan is quite willing to provide evidence for people not to believe the Bible and to be drawn away to him and his plans. If you don't accept God, he doesn't really bother you much because you're already his to begin with. It's only people that are actively seeking God and with God that Satan really attacks. And so he sends demonic fallen angels. When they come to earth, they take the form of aliens, or, let's face it, they're not limited to appearing like an organic creature. They could also appear to be a UFO. They could take the form of a ship. They can shift shape to suit the need, right? So Satan is quite willing to provide evidence that will deceive people so that they will go with him to hell. I'm just being really blunt.
Yeah. Just cutting through it.
Now, the Bible even tells us that we've entertained angels unaware because they were appearing as humans, and they didn't appear monstrous or strange or alien to us.
Right.
But Satan will manufacture the evidence to draw people away. And so these alien sightings are nothing but demonic activity. And when you see the stories or read the stories, whatever, of, say, UFOs in the desert at night, streaking across at high speeds, and suddenly makes a right-hand turn and don't slow down, they maintain speed at a 90-degree angle. That breaks every law of physics in nature. That's unnatural. But it does not break any law in the supernatural. Which shows you that, again, that these are supernatural events, that these are demonic spirits. And so this is just deception to deceive people, to get them to go with Satan.
Very interesting.
Well, there's a little more to it, too, because, but think about it.
Yeah.
How can I say all these things? Well, first of all, remember what Jesus said. When you die, you are no longer married. You will know each other. You will recognize each other in heaven, but you're no longer married. You will be like the angels, neither marrying nor given in marriage. They don't have DNA. They do not reproduce. God made all of them at one time. Actually, he made them on day one of creation. And if he wanted more, he'd make more. But they don't procreate. They don't reproduce. They don't have a physical body. They can appear in a physical body, but they don't have one, actually. And so this ability that allows them, again, to represent whatever God wants them to do. And so we have to deal with those issues to properly understand what all this alien and UFO stuff is all about.
Yeah. Wow.
That's good stuff.
Lot to chew on there. Lot to think about.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing those intriguing ideas.
Yeah.
Just facts, nothing but the facts.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, we've had a great time with you, Dr. McMurtry, and just thank you so much for sharing all these great insights with us. And
more than welcome.
yeah, it's been a pleasure having you here with us for a few days, and really looking forward to continuing to learn more and more about some of the things that you've been sharing. So thank you so much.
Yes,
and
thank you.
My pleasure.
yeah, so
Awesome.
we hope that you've enjoyed this, and if you have some more interests, definitely go to the website that we mentioned so you can check out some more resources, and hope that this has encouraged you. I'm thinking about some of the things that we were talking about today, just again, just building our faith, seeing over and over again that God's word is true, that God is alive, he's real, Jesus is risen, he's for us, he's coming for us.
Yeah.
And when we go back in history and we see all of these things stack up over and over and over again, just proving, the word to be true, God's story to be true for us, it gives us great confidence knowing that all the promises of God are backed by heaven.
Yeah. And it helps us to see just how big he is, just a glimpse of it's just amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible. So Jesus is coming again.
Amen.
And we are looking forward to that when we can see him face to face and get all the other inside scoop on what's gone on over the last 6,000 years. I can't wait to see some of the videotapes in heaven. Hey, show me some dinosaurs. Show me some rerun some years back there so I can see what really happened. That'd be cool.
Yeah, we'll find out if the Flintstones were accurate at all, won't we?
They weren't accurate. They weren't accurate except for Dino Burger.
Well, again, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this real life talk today, and we'll see you in the future with another one. So God bless you all, and keep growing in your faith.